Dmitri Alperovitch is a geopolitical analyst focused on Russia and China. He joins us here at the Munich Security Conference. Thanks for speaking to us, Dmitri. So, Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has just been talking to the audience here. He's been trying to push back against the current mood of pessimism over the war, and he said that, it's a myth that Russia cannot win this war. What's your view on that?
Well, I think you have to look at where we are. And I think a lot of people have this pessimistic view because they've seen what Russia can do in terms of wrapping up its industrial production and been able to, let's face it, outpace the West in producing artillery shells and other munitions. However, we have to appreciate that the Russians have burned through 40% of their reserves in doing so. They can't continue this forever. This is a war of attrition. And in the war of attrition, the party that wins is the one that can outlast the other. The Russians can continue doing this for a few years. They can't do it indefinitely. The West has more resources. The big question is, do we have the will?
Yeah, so let's dig into that. In terms of the will, Zelensky has just received security agreements from Germany, from France, and the UK. So these are kind of promises from Western countries to keep supporting Ukraine in the long term, but they're not like guarantees that they would actually kind of jump to their defense, to Ukraine's defense. So how meaningful are these agreements?
I think they're good for public relations, but let's face it, this is not NATO membership. This is not Article 5 guarantees. This is not the promise that Europe or the West more broadly will come to Ukraine's defense if they're invaded by Russia. And that's really the main issue for this war. Yes, Ukraine wants to take its lands back. That's really important, and obviously liberate its people. But the thing that it wants more than anything else is durable security to make sure that Russia cannot do it again to them. And that's what it needs to figure out how to accomplish.
Yeah, so let's get to that in a moment, but just kind of focusing on the degree of support like currently and in the months ahead. Obviously, there are big questions about the US right now. So we have a package of support that's gone through the Senate, questions about whether that will go through the House of Representatives. What happens if that support really does collapse politically this year?
It'll get very ugly. We have seen just today, Ukraine withdrew from Adiivka, the city that the Russians have been trying to take since 2014. And now they've taken it, unfortunately, today. You're going to see a lot more of this happening in the coming months if this aid package does not come. The reality is you cannot defend territory if you don't have artillery, if you don't have other munitions. And the Ukrainians are running out of everything right now.
I mean, Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, sort of implicitly said that Ukraine would simply lose this war if American support fell off. Is that ultimately your view?
I think that's a very fair characterization. Look, you cannot defend if you don't have weapons. And this front can still collapse. A lot of people have been talking for the last 6 months, this war's in a stalemate. Well, it's not a stalemate. The Russians are on the offensive. And they can make gains if the Ukrainians don't have artillery, if they don't have armored vehicles, if they cannot stop this Russian advance.
So let's look through some more scenarios. Say U.S. support does get through, at least in some degree. Later this year, of course, there's the U.S. election. Donald Trump could potentially be in the White House. What's your expectations for how he would approach this? He said that he would find a solution to this war in 24 hours, which presumably means caving into Putin.
Well, I'm not going to predict what Donald Trump is going to do. I think that's impossible to know. However, I'll point out for people that have this doom attitude of the Trump presidency in regards to Ukraine, is that Donald Trump was actually the first one to provide weapons to Ukraine in 2018 with the Javelin missiles. So who knows? It's impossible to predict. But the reality is that Ukraine is going to need support for years to come. This is not going to be a quick victory. The Russians can continue their offensives for at least the next couple of years. So we have to be thinking about this in the long term.
So yeah, and ultimately it's a combination of military stamina, but also the political stamina to back that up. It basically does come down to this kind of battle of the systems that people talk about, right? The Putin autocratic system versus the pluralistic democratic system of the West. Like, how do you rate their chances?
Well, the thing we have to look at is not only is there, from our security perspective, is it important for the West to make sure that Putin does not defeat Ukraine, that he does not advance to the borders of Europe, even in more of a way that he is today? But also the money that is being spent is mostly being spent in Western countries. It is being spent on an industrial base. It is a jobs program. Vast majority of the money that is in this bill that the House of Representatives may be considering is going to American companies and American workers that are going to be producing those munitions that will ultimately go to Ukraine. It's not money that we're turning over to the Ukrainians. So it is good for our economy, it's good for our security because we're enlarging our production for potentially other conflicts like Taiwan and China that is on the horizon. So there's lots of reasons to do this, not just uniquely focused on Ukraine itself.
And yet it is becoming increasingly politically controversial, not just in the US, but also in many European countries where there's a pressure from the far right. The kind of vulnerabilities of Western democracies are kind of out in the open. The vulnerabilities of the Putin system are more hidden, and they just kind of, you get a peek at them sometime. Like, what's your feeling about how strong Putin's position is right now? I mean, he's just killed his last really significant remaining political opponent.
Yeah, well, let's be honest, that President Putin has not had a competitive election in many years now. To the extent that he's had elections, he's had to rig them, not to win necessarily because he had the support to win it, but he wanted to show high popularity numbers, and he had to stuff the ballot boxes to some extent to help show that. But the reality is that Russia is incredibly weak. Even though its GDP grew last year, it was because of basically them engaging in military Keynesianism. That is not productive for their economy. And the reality is so much of their young people are at war and dying in that war. This is killing Russia in the long term, literally and figuratively. And we need to realize that we have all the advantages. We can outlast them if we have the will to do so.
So this really is a battle of wills. Assuming that both sides can maintain that will, I mean, is there any end in sight? We're kind of 2 years into this, but if you add the period after, Crimea and the Donbass, maybe we're 12 years into this. I mean, 10 years rather. So, I mean, could this go on for another 10 years, do you think?
I don't think at this level of intensity, Russia cannot sustain this. They spent 40% of their reserves last year. This is not sustainable for them. Could they do it for 2 years, maybe 3? Yes, but not much more than that. And that is, I think, the problem that has been characterized by this inaction that we're seeing in the West, is that no one has defined, and this is true of both Ukraine and the rest of the coalition, no one has defined what victory looks like. And the way that you win this war is by outlasting Russia. And if you can last for 2 to 3 years, providing support to Ukraine, their back will break, their economic break, the industrial back, and that is how you win.
So let's look at what a victory potentially could look like. I mean, everyone says ultimately this is going to end in negotiations. What is the kind of give and take that you think is kind of realistic? Of course, the Ukrainians say that they want all of their territory back and they want to get into NATO. Do you see that as realistic?
Well, we'll have to see. This year is a year of building, so assuming the aid comes, the Ukrainians are going to spend it, try and rebuild their offensive capacity to try it again, and we'll see how much territory they take. Ultimately, where the line is going to be drawn, whether it's going to be at the original 2014 borders or not, is going to depend on how much progress they can make in retaking it. But the main issue is actually not the land. The main issue that you're going to have is how does Ukraine get durable security guarantees? Obviously, it wants to get into NATO, it wants Article 5 protection. Russia is not going to want to give it to them. So it depends on how much pressure it can put on Russia that Russia is going to acquiesce to their accession to NATO.
So that's ultimately it. Russia has to be as much on the back foot as possible, right?
It has to be on the back foot, and it has to be on the back foot economically. This is actually, you don't win this battle just fighting on the battlefields in Ukraine. You have to break the backbone of the Russian economy, and you have to make sure that they go through their reserves. You have to keep the sanctions up on their industries, and particularly the price cap on their oil, to make sure that they're not able to get significant revenues from their energy sales.
And ultimately, when it does come to some kind of negotiation, China is going to be involved. Yeah, I mean, China is obviously Russia's most important supporter. China is not likely to be very keen on the idea of NATO expanding to include Ukraine. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think that China is going to want to be a big player because, frankly, we can shame them. The reality is that they can put a lot of pressure on Russia. They keep talking about the need for a ceasefire and the need to end this war. Well, they have a lot of leverage here with Russia, and they have applied none of it. The reality is they've refused mostly to meet with the Ukrainians. So they're big proponents of peace, but they don't want to talk to the party that is being one of the parties in this war, that is obviously the aggrieved party. That is absolutely hypocritical, and we have not done enough to call them out on it.
So looking ahead to this year, obviously there are an awful lot of wildcards, an awful lot of uncertainties. Like, what is the one thing that you would say to our viewers that you are really watching out for this year that will be a real test of the years to come?
Well, that's an easy one, the aid package. You have to see that get through. If it doesn't, Ukraine is in great danger of a collapse across the entire front line. And people think that this is just about, well, how much territory can it take? No. If Ukraine does not get aid, you may see Russian troops again near Kyiv and have potential to take Kyiv. Not in the coming months, but potentially by the end of the year. So that aid package is absolutely essential.
Dmitri Alperovitch, thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.